Um, a lot of us think that Toronto is one of the most similar cities to Sydney. Um, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And partly, of course, it's the inheritance of the adapted Westminster form of government means that the way things work is mutually understandable to each other. But they're both cities that are growing much faster than any of the coastal cities in the U.S. And so there's a lot to learn from that, from the pressures of growth. Now, of course, we're in a moment when all the normal things we try to work on as urbanists still matter, but they're not what people are thinking about for the moment because we are in the middle of a global pandemic. And it's a pandemic that is taking off in cities and predictably has begun a narrative that cities are dangerous, as always happens. So it's a time when we have a lot of sorting out to do. I'm going to read you Mary's bio and then turn this over. The way this works, those of you who have joined for previous ones of these, Mary will make some remarks. Then I'll start asking questions, and you all can ask questions via Zoom, and I will do my best to get through them and combine them and ask them. So Mary Rowe is a leading urban advocate and civil society leader who has worked in cities across Canada and the United States. Mary comes to CUI with several years of experience as urban advocate and community leader, including serving as executive vice president of the Municipal Art Society of New York. That's where I first met her. One of America's oldest civic advocacy organizations, focused on the built environment. A mid-career fellowship with the Blue Moon Fund led her to New Orleans, where she worked with national philanthropic and community leaders to support rebuilding after Katrina. Prior, Mary was president of the Canadian platform Ideas That Matter, a convening and publishing program based on the work of Jane Jacobs. So, a very impressive bio. That is just the start. Mary, thank you so much for making time for us, and let me turn it over to you. You are muted.
Thanks for asking me under rather horrible circumstances. But I enjoyed the holding slide you had there, Gabe. You just have that beautiful, beautiful waterfront shot of Sydney. And we were looking forward to having you come at the end of May. And there'll be hopefully another opportunity. And I hope that we'll have similarly an opportunity to come to you because, as you suggest, we have a kind of shared colonial history, but then we've got all sorts of other kinds of aspects of how intrinsic culture is to the way in which our urban vibrancy works, and all sorts of interesting comparators. So I'm going to just walk you through a little bit what the Canadian Urban Institute is, but what we're focusing on now, post-COVID or in the midst of COVID, and then we can talk a little bit about post-COVID, although I've got to tell you that I'm very skeptical about prognostications. I don't think we really know what's ahead, and I think we have to be really disciplined in trying to stick to what we're actually observing and seeing, and try to not. I appreciate it's a tendency. We all sort of want to sit back and say, well, look, I've always been saying this about cities, and now look. And even the people that are suggesting that cities are done, there are people that have believed that for some time, as you suggest. It's almost a cultural meme, I think. It has a kind of historic, almost religious root that cities are evil and, dens of iniquity and things like that. And even if you look at the language of rebuilding, revitalization, recovery, it's always implying that there was something bad about a city that you had to kind of change. And so we live with that, I think. But I also think that they're unbelievably resilient, right? And they outlast corporations, they outlast governments. And there's something about the way that human beings congregate and want to be together, and we will continue to find ways to do that. So anyway, I'm going to go to my slides. We'll just see how tricky that is to do that. There, can you see my slides? Are you seeing my slides, Gabe?
No.
You're not. I guess that's because I'm not sharing my screen. That might be why. Just a minute. Okay, down here. I get to see you. And now we'll
Yeah,
go to my
good.
slides. Now?
Now.
Okay. So Canada's a big place in terms of geography, and it's about 35 million people. And the Canadian Urban Institute's been around for 30 years. It started in 1990, a very different time, and had for a number of years focused on urban development after the Berlin Wall fell. So it had a lot of support to do international development work in Eastern Europe and a certain amount in different parts of the Philippines, other parts of the world, and has in more recent years started to focus more on sort of the proposition for Canada about what the nature of urban life needs to be in Canada and how important it is to the way Canada functions. Just to give you a bit of a comparator, Canada's 82% urban, and if you took a definition of 5,000 people or more, almost 90% of Canada lives urban. Makes us one of the most urbanized in the world. And then we just, for the heck of it, threw up one of these livable cities indexes just to show you that there we are with 3 cities in the top list, and you have 3 cities too. So as we suggested, something is going well in terms of how we make cities in our various in our 2 countries. And I've been, since I had my teeth sort of cut on this in New Orleans, learned quickly that resilience and livability have to go hand in hand. You can't do one without the other. So although our cities may be livable, how resilient are they is the question. And similarly, are there cities that we can make very resilient, but they're actually kind of boring to be in? So this is the dilemma that I think we're all struggling with now. And we have this remarkable challenge, but we've also got a remarkable opportunity to try to really distill what we think the best learnings are going to be out of this, and how do we understand where we need to go forward. So back to Canada, just to give you a sense of this, our population is aging and we rely on newcomers. And so we have historically accepted large numbers of immigrants, more percentage-wise than many other countries around the world. And you can see, if you look to the right map there, you'll see that they disproportionately come to the 2 most urbanized provinces, Ontario and Quebec. And where are the highest incidences of COVID? They are in Quebec and Ontario. And as you can see, some of this is reflective of the industrial development in Canada. So Alberta, where there was a big oil industry, attracted a good number in those 5 years. That has dropped off considerably. And then of course BC as well has for years. And as with many great, and Gabe, you and I have talked about this for years, because when I was in New York and you were in San Francisco, we were talking about this as well, that as a city grows and as it becomes more technically successful, it also spins off all sorts of other challenges and greater inequality. And so we ran these numbers to show that, income inequality in Canadian cities as they've been growing has also grown. And this is one of the phenomenons, I think, that we haven't really ever wrestled to the ground about how do we actually cope with this. And Toronto, prior to the current era we're in, the COVID era, had more cranes in the sky and more development than any city in the world. For whatever set of interesting reasons, not so much anymore, but we did. And we also have a systemic, deep underlying poverty that we have not been able to crack. I said in a piece that I wrote this week that I actually stole from our colleague, Eric Kleinenberg, who's at NYU in New York City. But in early 2000, he was commenting on his PhD thesis, which was based on the impact of the heat wave in Chicago, and which he studied as a doctoral student. And what he saw there was that the areas that where people did less well, where more people died in Chicago, were the neighborhoods where nobody knew each other and where the built form discouraged any kind of social cohesion. And he said that the heat wave was a particle accelerator for the underlying dysfunction in Chicago that existed before that heat wave hit, and then in 3 days it manifested. And that's what I think we have now, is COVID is a particle accelerator for all the ways in which not just our urban environments, but our global economy wasn't functioning in a healthy way, and now it's being exposed. So this is a slide that I was using before what we dealt with, what we're dealing with now. And this was just to talk about the different resilience challenges that we were experiencing in Canadian cities. Flooding, obviously the pandemic, which we added, fires, and then just all the different ways in which climate change stuff, air quality, all the different ways in which Canadian cities, in our view at CUI, we were not as equipped as we needed to be to anticipate what our resilience challenges were going to be. And this is another piece to just give you context for us. Here's our pictures of various scenes in Canada, and not to be terribly stereotypical, but there's Ottawa with the Rideau Canal and winter, and a lot of Canadian life is spent outdoors, and it is spent in these large congregating spaces, and all of this, of course, is completely up for grabs now. And how are we going to navigate this when public space and shared spaces like this can no longer be, or for whatever period of time, we can't occupy them safely? So this is our COVID heat map and our remaining A map in Canada. One of the reasons I'm putting this up, though, is that this is a map that shows where the incidences are, and this has been generated with user data. And if you go to flatten.ca, you'll see the domain name up in the top left there. The interesting story about this is that this is an 18-year-old first-year engineering science student who, when the classes were canceled or when they went into hiatus before they went into online learning, had some time and called a bunch of his buddies and said, why don't we see if we can build this? And they did, and now they have all sorts of AI specialists and people involved in the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research and highly, highly sophisticated people helping them build a user-generated tool to see if they can get a bead, as you can see, on how the virus is being spread here. And one of the reasons that I wanted to illustrate this is that so much of what I think we're going to learn is that the innovative response that will come out of communities and come out of individuals and people working on the ground that you wouldn't necessarily expect, that hierarchical systems of transfer of information break down. And yes, you need to have a strong, clear data and authority from senior authorities telling you what's going on. But at the same time, all sorts of really smart approaches are bubbling up from the least predictable spaces, including a 18-year-old first-year student in engineering science who said, let's put up our own map. So CUI, this entity that I run, we really, in Canada, because we're so dispersed physically, we recognize that we in Canada do vertical quite well. Cities respond to provinces that respond to the federal government, and that there's a good vertical chain of information and learning and funding. But we don't do horizontal well. And we are actually quite not very dense as a country. And so unlike Europe or unlike America, where there are many, many, many cities, and where the workforce gravitates, and how they did a job in, like you and I did, Gabe, we had a job in New York, and then we were in Washington, then we went to San Francisco, and then we did a stint in Chicago. That doesn't happen in Canada. People tend to make their career in one place, they stay there, and there isn't that much of an opportunity to learn and to be able to share practice. And you have vast distances. You also have cultural differences, in our case, linguistic differences. The Rocky Mountains is a very strong, impenetrable piece of topography that is symbolically isolates us as well. And so we at CUI really start to focus on how do we actually build this connective tissue and get learning networks going horizontally to connect, catalyze, and communicate, with the belief that we will learn faster, we'll fail faster, we'll adapt better, we will catalyze more of a cohesive kind of self-organizing approach to urbanism. So that's what we were focused on before all this broke out. And that influenced our putting up 2 platforms that we've done in the last 2 weeks. And this has been done with our staff, which are small, and then lots of partners and volunteers and people working through the night across 5 time zones to see if we could get some space, some safe places to put information. Also recognizing that municipal government staff and provincial staff and federal staff too have no time. They have no bandwidth to do this themselves. And so we, in essence, set up a kind of parallel structure that we could populate with our own steam, and then it would give people a quick glance to be able to see what was going on. So City Watch Canada is 62 cities across the country giving constant daily updates on where are they with their libraries? Where are they with their parks? How are they having council meetings? Where are they with their budget? Have they declared states of emergency? And that gets updated on a 24-hour cycle by volunteers. So that was the first thing we did. And then you can see there, it has a dashboard that gives you these kinds of stats at a glance, and a map and all that kind of stuff. And we built that. My staff, my colleagues built this. And then we at the same time said, let's start talking about all the resourceful ways that groups and individuals in communities are going to start to respond. And so we had City Watch, was just the facts, and City Share is all the different kinds of caremongering and different kinds of systems that people are putting up. And this is what it looks like. And if you go to citysharecanada.ca or citywatchcanada.ca, you're going to see this is, again, populated by volunteers, constantly being updated, and really gives you a sense of how different groups are responding resourcefully and where are the innovations. And we're continuing to populate these. We're watching for the patterns. We've just now launched a third city talk. This one, which is really, as you can see, we had one this morning, earlier today. In our time. We're starting to have conversations to kind of compare notes. We have a sense people need to make sense of this. They need to have a space to explore. There's really no expert that's got all the answers here. So how do we create platforms to interpret and, again, adapt and try to anticipate what the future may look like, or at least even the present, and then the short-term future and the future. So that's good, future. So these are the kinds of things that come up on these sites. You'll see, I mean, these are, I'm sure you have them in Australia, just like we do. Examples of local ingenuity, companies repurposing themselves, community groups finding a new kind of focus for themselves, how they're learning. You know, for instance, all our libraries now are becoming places for food banks to distribute. I'm sure you have the examples we have of all the distilleries going into the hand sanitizer business. But this happens at a really uber granular level too. So how are neighborhoods responding? How are different municipal agencies responding? You know, municipal staff are being, in Canada's case, they're being redeployed into other kinds of functions. But it's also, of course, sparking a question about how are we going to hold on to our local businesses? What are the implications for local retail? Are there ways for customers to be able to show support to their consumers, to their purveyors that they're used to, in addition to, you know, instead of going to their big box stores, they want to keep that local store busy. Maybe the local store actually is a safer alternative for them than actually going into a larger supermarket. And this is another great example in Calgary. The previous one I just showed you was Edmonton. This one is in Calgary, where they're going to students and asking them to start drawing and expressing and reporting what they're seeing, as you can see there, pop-up journalism. So, you know, I think the large picture for us, and what I think we need to reflect on at CUI is, where is the leadership coming from? We have a very strong prime minister and a federation of provincial premiers. Many of these people do not have, they're not part of the same political party. They have all sorts of ideological differences, but I would say for the most part here in Canada, we have seen extraordinary alignment between the federal government and the provincial governments and the medical officers of health at each level. They've been highly coordinated. I think it's a little more difficult though, because at the municipal level in Canada, cities have no independent status. They are not part of the Canadian Constitution, so they are basically subject to their provincial leader, the provincial legislature. So that makes it a little more difficult. They're dependent on the property tax for resources. They have some transfers, but often not enough. And I think it's one of the things that we're starting to see is that the people that are really on the front lines of this are local mayors, local councillors. And I think the federal government has been consultative and trying to keep the channels open. But structurally, municipalities in Canada lack the authority and the resources that they probably should have, or that this crisis is going to illustrate, for them to be able to respond more quickly and more deliberatively, and more particularly to whatever their challenge is. So these are the mayors across the country. And as you can see, the other thing that's sort of striking to me about this is you can see that 80% of the population in Canada is 100 miles from the US border. And that's in many places a completely unprotected border. And as you all know, the US is now the epicenter of the outbreak, and we are extraordinarily vulnerable to the transmission of the virus coming up from the south, but also trade and all our supply chains are completely interlinked. And there was a bit of a brouhaha in the last 48 hours about whether a 3M shipment of PPE supplies was going to be allowed across the border because the Americans might want to keep it, you know, all that kind of stuff. So this is the context in which we live. It's quite different than what you have. We have I think we have the longest unsecured, unarmed border in the world, and there it is. So last thing, and then Gabe, you and I can have a chat. we're asking ourselves all sorts of questions about, we're trying to, as I suggested, stay grounded in it. We had two principles when we were putting those platforms up. One was we were not going to get in the way of emergency services, and we weren't going to supplant them. We wanted to make way so that we could carry on with some parallel activity and help do peer-to-peer learning, recognizing though that municipal governments and provincial governments and civil servants across the country are in often life and death situations, and we didn't want to get in the way of that. And the other thing we didn't want to do is we didn't want to share, spread misinformation. And so we have really been vigilant on both of those things. The third one I want to offer is that I think we have to be very careful about any kind of broad brush prognosticating. Lots of people have a mindset that they may have had going into the situation, and we all have to be careful to not make sure we're not just going to kind of reinforce our own view and use this crisis as a way to do that. So I'm hesitant, as I suggested, to make these predictions. I think what we need to do is really pay attention and learn like crazy to understand how are people responding in urban environments now, and what can we learn from where the transit pressure is, how people want access to public space, how is housing going to be, how can we be more creative about providing housing for vulnerable populations. As we repurpose certain kinds of structures across the country for temporary use, are there things that we should be paying attention that could in fact be permanent use? What's going to happen to our libraries and our shared facilities when you can't actually meet? And in the short term, and maybe in the intermediate term, if we're going to continue to have social distancing, what does that mean for cultural events? I know Richard Florida was on here last week and probably raised that with you. You know, are we going to have to look at that differently? Are we going to have to anticipate that we're going to be in and out of these kinds of situations? And so do we need infrastructure and provisions and rules that can be adopted quite quickly? So do we need to harden bike lanes overnight if we know that we're going to go into lockdown in 48 hours and we want to make it easier to get around by bike? So does that mean you have some flexible infrastructure that you could snap into place to do that? Similarly, are there all the restaurants that are now, I don't know if that's happening in Australia, but here, everyone is kitting themselves up to do takeouts, and is that a capacity that any food service entity is going to have to be able to do to quickly move to that? And then I guess there's sort of some really big systemic fundamental questions. What happens to dense downtowns? What's happening to the way that people are separated, living far away from their workplace? Is this whole move to virtual working going to change that? Are we going to be able to distribute where people actually do their work closer to their homes, or not? Do we have to say goodbye to street retail? I really hope not. That's the particle accelerator piece that I'm fearful of, because street retail was probably already languishing. Let's just hope this isn't the end of it. In fact, maybe there'll be a resurgence. I don't know. But you and I know, any urbanist on this call will know that the implications to lose street retail aren't just the shop. It's the small business, it's the people that are employed there, it's the people that live above that store, it's the fact that there are people going in and out on the street to purchase stuff at that store, it's eyes on the street, it's public safety, it has multiple implications for us, and particularly for urban economies that are completely dependent on these kinds of service exchange businesses. So, and then in the bottom right, you'll see, obviously, we're getting at how are we going to engage? How are we going to arrive at decision making when we can't actually gather physically? How are we going to make sure that our democracy and our participatory processes that arrive at development decisions and public policy decisions, how are we going to do that if we can't physically engage in the same way? And we have a couple of cities here experimenting with opening streets, prohibiting cars and letting people do social distancing walks. I think you've probably done the same there. Does that mean something? Should we learn something there permanently? Are we going to be repurposing commercial buildings? All that kind of thing. So I could go on and on, but why don't I just stop there? And then you and I can have some exchange and compare some notes in terms of our jurisdictions. Okay?
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary. And normally this is when you'd hear the applause for your remarks, but you just have to imagine. Mary, I'm curious, many people have observed that it's not high density cities that are inherently the problem. And usually that argument hinges on pointing to the Asian technocracies, so Hong Kong or Singapore. And there's just something that I think is shocking how hard it is for Westerners to learn anything from those societies. It's like it's totally discounted. Like
Yeah.
that's just so different. We can't possibly learn, which I am hoping this experience helps us get over. But as you compare the Canadian urban experience so far with the pandemic, with either the, you know, the places that seem to be really struggling, like New York and London, or some of the places that seem to be doing better, like Singapore. How would you say Canada is managing this?
Yeah, well, first of all, uh, urbanism is not a consistently uniform thing in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So last year, Larry Beasley, the former city planner for Vancouver, wrote a book called Vancouverism, and a lot of, not all, but certain folks in Vancouver think that they've got this nailed. This is what urbanism should be. And I said at the time to Larry, Larry, let's be careful here. Like maybe we have Edmontonism and we have Winnipegism and we have Torontoism and we have Montrealism. Like these cities all have different patterns and different based on topography and history and culture and all sorts of sort of serendipity. A lot of what made Toronto was that there was a language law in the 80s introduced in Quebec, which sent all the Fortune 500 companies out of Montreal. And that kind of built the business core, the corporate core, finance core in Toronto. And then Montreal has gone in quite a different path as a result. So I think I'd be a little careful about the generalizations about urbanism. Mm-hmm. What I would say is density, as you suggest, is different in different kinds of places. And we have, in Toronto, if we just take Toronto, within the region, remember we function as a region now. So we have Toronto proper, which is 2.5 million. But if you take the region, you're almost the size of, you're a little bit bigger than you. We're probably up to 8.5 million across the whole GTA region. And there's quite a lot of diversity and variation there. So yes, there's some density right downtown. There are 80, 90-story buildings, and those are commercial buildings, and there are some 90-story residential buildings going in. But we have lots and lots of parts of Toronto that are not that high. The density is more gradual, where it might be in the older parts of the city, it might be 4-story density. The dilemma that we've had is that we are part of, and I don't know if you are to the same extent that we are, but we are part of that American mythology of single family home, lawn, a certain standard of living, a certain understanding of a nuclear family, and this is what you aspire to. And there's been a big battle here for the last decade about, I am a young person, and I am being deprived of my entitlement to own my own front-facing, street-facing home. And I think that the discourse has kind of become, well, you either have a house or you live in a high-rise, a condo, what we call a condo. And there hasn't been a lot of cultural understanding that there's actually midpoints in that. And also we haven't had a market that really supported it. So the construction industry built like crazy, those high-end, both high, tall and high expensive, and condominium units. And there was just not enough of sort of what is called here the missing middle. So townhomes and different kinds of densities. So I think, as you suggest, that wouldn't it be great if we could say urbanism doesn't have to be one or the other? It can actually continue to be a mix. I think cities are about choice. But I also think that we need to be, and it'll be interesting to see post-COVID if we'll have more public support for this. Because if you look in Europe, they were able to build, and New York City, they've been able to build remarkable density at 6 stories that spans out for vast distances. When I lived in New York City and I used to ride my bike from my office, which was at 51st and Madison, to my apartment, which was at 193rd and Broadway, that's a heck of a ride. And I couldn't get over. I would go block after block after block of 6 stories, 6 stories, 6 stories. So
the Parisian density. Yes,
the Parisian density. So can we get ourselves to that kind of place? Because we've had a fierce NIMBY culture here in Canada, and again, it varies. But I think this is the real crux for us: is are we going to be able to demonstrate, people like you and I, urban advocates, that you can build denser neighborhoods that have an economic viability to them? There's enough property tax, there's enough there's enough street frontage so that you can have some commercial life, you can have some retail life, you can have some public space, you can have some shared community amenities, and you can have transit. But you've got to have enough density to be able to have that infrastructure, as you know. And if it's not dense, you won't have it. And I think that's where the incidence of the virus is going to be so tricky, because there may be a perception that because you're less dense, you're safer. But in fact, if you fall ill, you're far away from the supports that you need. Right.
I wrote an essay last week, sort of defending urbanism, pointing out that there's lots of very high density cities that are handling this better, and what do we learn from them?
Sure.
And kind of making the argument that the problem isn't density, the problem is incompetent government, to which someone emailed me separately and said, I think you've just made an argument that America shouldn't have any high density cities. And like if you're literally saying you shouldn't have that unless you have competent government, then what does that mean for America? And it also reminded me that as Scandinavia began to block flights from the United States, their list of countries was countries that are lacking what they call collective infrastructure. And that, of course, is where Canadian cities and Australian cities, existing within a national context of universal health care, are light years ahead of countries like the United States in terms of an enabling environment where urbanism can be successful. When we turn, though, to things like public transport, Mary, that's where I get worried. Is
this going to send people into their cars, you mean?
It's going to send people into their cars. If you're New York City, it can't, because New York just can't work.
You don't have a choice.
But the RPA always, one of their factoids that they say a lot is 50% of the transit riders in the United States are in New York. And for all the other cities that are struggling to get people to switch to ride public transport, this could be a real setback. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it, that there's so many implications for this. I mean, we had a call earlier today where people were making a big pitch for streets. Yeah. That the great public asset that any city has that's publicly owned are its streets. And how do we take those streets and repurpose them? And repurpose them in the short term, because you need places for people to walk. But is that something that should be, not just now, but could be piloted for longer periods of time? And we all know of examples of Calgary's taken some streets and pedestrianized them permanently, and then they were one of the first cities in Canada this last couple of weeks to actually close some streets to traffic so people could socially distance walk. I think there's remarkable opportunity here to rethink transit. I'm like you, like we can be concerned about the broader piece about, there's another reason to drop transit. But you and I know that people will do that for a period of time, but then the streets will get so crowded with cars that they'll quickly say, well, we're not going to do that. So we have to solve transit. Yeah. And it seems to me a couple of things. One, I think there are going to be smart ways that designers and engineers are going to figure out how we can safely ride transit. Even now in Toronto, they have a whole computer system now that's activated that a bus knows or a streetcar knows when it has the capacity that it can't exceed without risking social distancing. So they won't pick up anybody if they're after 15, let's say about 15 people or whatever it is. So that's already happening. I think the piece that we need is more flexible transit. And again, this would be to me a precondition to COVID. We have most of our transit capacity is in subways that run down the spine of the city. And in fact, at the base of the spine, those people aren't going to work. So that's actually not where we need transit right now. Where we need transit is in the far areas where support workers are coming in to go to hospitals and essential service jobs, and we don't have the capacity there. So what you want is, I think, some kind of really adaptive, flexible system so you can send more buses or change those routes, and so I think that's a big encouragement for BRT, for different kinds of jitneys, all sorts of informal kinds of things that somehow have to be made safe. I know that this is a hugely controversial thing, and ride hailing has upturned every municipal government you and I know, trying to cope with Uber and various things, and whether those are safe. But this is going to compel us, I think, to try to figure out how do we get adaptive transit that's really flexible. And also it's going to have to be affordable. I continue to wonder, we had a whole bunch of stuff here about over the couple of weeks that we've had to make these changes to bring people in the back doors so that it's contactless entry, and then eventually just not charging at all. And I think that, again, all of this, you can feel the dollar signs tick, tick, tick. How are we going to pay for these things? But if this is part of the pulsing of how a city can be an adaptive organism, and it has to be able to change and weave and adapt, you have to get rid of the friction. And one of the frictions is paying.
A good friend of mine who does this kind of work in Singapore says the number one thing we have to do to make public transport viable is get Westerners to wear masks. Like, it's very simple. So that if you have the flu and you cough, you don't spread it to as many people, and it's the thing that doesn't require a vastly expensive reconceptualization of how the urban metabolism works. But I think your point about converting streets quickly to bicycle highways and just public space, so you're not crowded onto the footpaths, is probably the other thing that's available to do immediately that would have a huge impact. Look, I have so many questions for you, and everybody in the audience, feel free to type questions. A lot of them, Mary, are that have come in so far are about public space, meaning some people asking, as part of the acceptance of living at higher densities for Australian and Canadian cities, the quality and availability of the public realm has to increase. That has to be the trade-off. But so far, that's proven really hard to do. So in the short run, what do we do to expand public space during this period of lockdown? But then how do we also use that in the long run to dramatically increase the availability and quality of public space? What do you see as the main opportunity?
Yeah, well, it's one of the, the old Joni Mitchell song, "Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone." I mean, it'll be interesting to see whether people are going to come out of this with a much stronger intensity around parks, public events, sporting events. My God, think of all these sports people. I was on a call this morning, the one that you're going to go to on Thursday, and you'll hear Europeans there, and they're just completely beside themselves about soccer. I mean, they really are beside themselves about what the hell has happened to their cultural life when they can't be playing football or soccer. So, so I'm wondering if that will come out as pent up demand, and a recognition that, well, I'm not going to take that for granted. But in the interim, I think we have to appropriate all sorts of unusual spaces. So I live on a main street, but up behind me is a laneway, and I actually walk in these laneways quite a bit right now because they're safe. There are not a lot of people on them, and I can imagine that we're going to start to appropriate different kinds of space, parking lots, waterfronts, laybys. As roads become less and less used, then all of a sudden, the shoulders are more safer to use. And so I think that piece is going to accelerate. I also think, though, that we can design these spaces to be adaptive. We can design parks and playgrounds to be pandemic proof. I just know designers will figure out ways to do that. And they will, and as you suggest, the fix on transit is that everybody wears masks if they're not well. The dilemma here with COVID, of course, is that I could have COVID and I don't know I have it and I could be spreading it. So this whole cultural question about whether we can get people to adjust to that and appreciate that the trade-off is you will have access to shared space. So can we design these places in such a way that we can use them when we're in pandemic mode and when we're off, when the rules loosen a bit, and if they get put back in, I'm also interested in civic spaces, libraries, community centers. We have a large chunk of people in urban Canada who have no access to the internet except to the library. So kids that are being sent home schoolwork, and maybe even if the school board gives them an iPad, they have no wireless to be able to do it. are we going to finally see commitment to ubiquitous wireless for everybody? Are we going to just make that legal and have the cities pay for it, or have somebody pay for it so that you don't have to have, or do we all just lift our passwords and make it and just share it amongst us? But in terms of libraries and community center functions, you know, there are people who are congregating around libraries because the libraries don't have password protected stuff, and there are people standing socially distanced on streets getting signals. What can we learn from that?
Yeah.
You know, how can we, you know that lovely expression in urban planning, desire paths? You know, that the planners look and say, well, actually, this is where we thought the sidewalks would go, but when you look, this is where the sidewalks, this is the people are choosing to walk this way. I think we need to look and see what are the desire paths that we're going to start to observe, and how people want their city to function for them. Yeah. And then how can we as planners and urbanists kind of shore that up and help design to enable that and resource that.
Mary, a couple of questions about community building, but in a very profound sense, emerging here. You know, one of the things that could happen is basically all of the gatherings that bring people together, the soccer matches in Europe, the basketball games in
Raptors
in the North American cities, church, going to concerts, whatever it is, right? It's lots of different things, but it's the sources of joy and meaning for you know, living in society are these gatherings where we come together. You can imagine people being really afraid to do that for a while and sort of living these lives mediated via the internet, and that's already sort of a trend. How do we call people back to community, both through the transition period where it's sort of safe, sort of not safe, and then hopefully after the transition period?
Well, again, you know, I'm assuming that this transition is going to be extended. You know, that we may be in a perpetual transition for a while. And so I don't know whether we can assume that things are going to lift, and maybe it will. Maybe we'll just go back. But I'm trying to anticipate, how do we have flexible responses that can draw in and draw out? You know, the tides go in, the tides go out. Like, how can we adjust ourselves to some kind of a cyclical capacity to adapt? Because you and I don't know what's next. You know, we may have you know, that old adage that we overlearn from history. So we're assuming that what we need to prepare for is a pandemic. But part of the concept of resilience is that you need to be adaptive to multiple threats. And so we may overcome this pandemic, and then who knows what the next one will be. And it may require different adaptation. I think the capacity to, as you suggest, we recognize there are certain things that are intrinsic to the way humans live and have for years, you know, for years and years and years and years and years. They congregate to worship. They exchange goods through a market mechanism. They experience joy through cultural expression. These are fundamental things. In the interim right now, isn't it remarkable how people are improvising? I did my church on Sunday with I was for a walk. I had an earpiece in my ear, and I was part of a religious service for that hour, listening. I was astonished how well it worked. And we see all these outpourings of cultural groups and things. It's not sustainable, obviously, but it's a way that we are adjusting temporarily, and then whether there will be aspects of that will stick, so that I'm still not convinced that there isn't a way to experience a shared public life in a socially distanced way. You know, I think there are ways to do it, and I bet we're going to figure it out. You know, people are very resourceful and smart. If you spend 10 seconds on that City Share Canada website, you will be platform. You'll just be blown away by how smart people are. They're coming up with all sorts of things that we hadn't have thought of. So I'm not prepared to abandon the collective experience within some proximity. You know, even the balcony gestures, the fact that we have balconies, and the fact that people can get out on their balcony and have some mutual expression and people will think of new ways to do it. And I think that I really think we've got to engage the design professions. We've got to engage resourceful entrepreneurs. This is why I want to decentralize and disaggregate as well as we can and get all hands on deck here and not get lulled into some kind of passive, oh, well, you know, government will take care of that or big business will take care of that. As you can see, you know, libraries are using their 3D printers to create plastic shields. We will find ways, and we need to challenge each other to find ways.
Yeah, great. There's a sense that we all believe this is temporary, and then we'll get through it, and maybe things will be different, maybe not, but we'll be able to get back to life. Some questions here, contrasting that a little bit with the Depression in the 1930s, which at a certain point, it didn't feel temporary. And so the sort of creativity that went into getting people back to work doing socially useful things rather than just paying people to stay home. So Bridget Smythe asks about artists. Can we imagine a sort of public works style program to employ artists, as was common in many countries in the 1930s? And you know, other sectors that have been hard hit. Just think about the ingenuity that went into paying people to do things that were socially valuable. Should we be trying to do that, for example, with artists?
Imagine what that would be, eh? I mean, I appreciate Bridget's point. You know, when I lived in the US, I was always struck by, you would come across another WPA project and you would think, oh, well, that's great. And, you know, the Americans built that fabulous national park system and trail system. I mean, this is how you actually built extraordinarily important social infrastructure at times when the economy was depressed, and it was a way to engage people. I think there's speculation in Canada. I don't know if it's happening there, that, you know, there was some experimentation with a universal basic income before this descended on us, and now a cash transfer is being made in many, many countries to individuals. At the end of that 3 or 4 months, are we going to say, well, actually, that's probably the kind of financial safety net you can claw it back when people pay their taxes if they didn't require it, but is that in fact not a kind of sustainable way to keep people liquid enough that they can function? And then, as you suggest, is there a way to repurpose? And what I'm interested in is the engagement piece, what you're suggesting. Artists are the most resourceful folks. They see patterns. They're extremely innovative, and they come up with ideas all the time. And I don't want to commodify art to the point and say, well, then if your art isn't useful, it's not art. But I do think that we've got to find platforms for people. And then the question is, does it have to be monetized in a market way, or can it be remunerate? Can there be a different kind of remuneration system that gives people some kind of return for what they're contributing to the whole? And so, yeah, I think we should be dreaming up what those systems are. I don't know whether we're going to come back to bartering. I'd be interested to know whether local currencies whether we're going to start to see a resurgence in local currency exchange. I bet you bartering is already happening. In fact, I think bartering is happening and nobody's calling it that. We're all doing things for each other. And then there's a kind of assumed reciprocity. I can do this, you can do that. It's not monetized, but maybe we'd get to a place where we would find a way to do that. I suspect that one of the ways that, and it's too early to tell, but this is just a guess, that one of the ways that street level retail will survive is because some kind of deal is struck with the landlord. And that speaks to landlords that have a relative, they have agency over, they're not over mortgaged and don't have the agency to be able to forgive the rent. But for those that can, are we going to see a different kind of understanding there? And we're already seeing people doing gift cards and buying cards, and artists are familiar with this. Artists have cobbled together this kind of, they have an ambivalent relationship with money, lots of them understandably, but there are lots of folks that find a way to navigate that, and I can invest in them and in what they're doing, and then there's some kind of an acknowledgement or return to me. It's not me being charitable, right?
Your comments about sort of local community have resonated with a bunch of the questions. the Greater Sydney Commission here has this notion of a what they call the 30-minute city, the idea that you should be able to have
Yeah.
everything you need within 30 minutes. You know, it's interesting. Places like some of the truly well-connected cities like London or Tokyo or New York, part of the implicit promise is you have access to the whole place because the grid of public transport will be so good. It's all yours, the whole metropolitan area. Places like Los Angeles have really relocalized where people, you don't have access to the whole thing. You live your life in a smaller part. So there's I think a bit of an ambivalent notion in here, but how do you feel, how is Toronto thinking about this?
I'm wondering can you do both? You know, can it be about choice? Because I think part of the dilemma is that people feel they have no choice. You know, even this notion that somehow we have a choice, well, we could abandon cities and not live in cities. Most people who live in cities have no choice. That they live in a city for a whole bunch of reasons, and that's where they've got to live. So I wonder whether there's a way to double down on strengthening what you do have. We hear 15-minute cities, so yours is a bit more extended. Your commission's guideline. That could you find more ways to support complete neighborhoods? I'm even wondering about downtown high rises. You know, is this really going to be the death knell of single-use buildings? So that you won't ever be in a situation where you have only a commercial use. Are you going to get to a place where every building in every neighborhood has to have all the ingredients so that if you do have to contain yourself for a period of time, you've got the amenities you need? Even if that means you're in an 80-story tower, that there would be some residential, some commercial, some institutional, some retail, all in that sort of community. And is that maybe, do you know what I'm getting at, Gabe? Like almost that we approach urbanism as a fractal, you know, that, or my friend Zita Cobb from Shorefast, who talks about a cauliflower, that the world is a cauliflower and we're all florets. If you take that to the urban context, then neighborhoods become the floret. And they have some dependency because they have a central stand that connects them to their florets. But could we double down on that? Could we double down on investing and creating the infrastructure to support that kind of pod? You can see it again when what we look at what's happening out of the communities. Communities are creating their own neighborhood pods. And they're getting 25 people or 30 people and they're on some kind of a network. That's just happened COVID. But that could be enabled. That could be enabled and the architecture could be created so that you could draw on that as you needed to. And you'd have it all in a certain vicinity. And that doesn't preclude that you don't leave it to go to another pod when you need something different or you want to have that connectivity. But you could retract yourself into your pod if you were in a circumstance like this.
Yeah. A question about public space. We're seeing some cities close down public spaces during the pandemic because too many people are using them and there's a fear that there won't be physical distancing. So New York, London, Sydney closed its beaches. And of course, the irony is then you're either stuck in your house or you are forcing everybody onto these very congested footpaths. Sidewalks.
Yeah.
The Atlantic yesterday ran a very persuasive piece arguing that the parks all over the world should be reopened, but police should enforce physical distancing within them and kind of help teach people how to inhabit them a bit differently. What is Toronto doing on this and other Canadian cities?
So I think you're right that we may need to adopt a certain kind of public space etiquette, and we should probably stop apologizing for it. You know, we all know that we don't litter. We all know that we don't go and flash or expose ourselves. Like we've learned over time that there are ways that are acceptable ways to behave in public. So surely we can get social distancing to be part of people's understanding. I think the dilemma we've had is that there hasn't been enough information or just we haven't recruited enough empathy in people to appreciate who they're putting at risk, the other people that are putting at risk. In Toronto, what the solution they had is that they shut playgrounds, but the park itself is still open. Mm-hmm. And they have police officers, you know, running around encouraging people to back away. But I'm a bit like you. I think that if you could, and I agree with the Atlantic, if we could get to a place where we had a kind of moral code There'll be obviously some deviance, but in the main, I think we've been at it long enough now that you can maybe assume that people are going to handle it better now than they maybe did 10 days ago when they didn't maybe take it too seriously. Right?
Yeah. All right. There are like a dozen more questions, but we're out of time. Any closing thoughts for the group? This has been a wonderful conversation, Mary, but any closing thoughts?
Well, in New Orleans, where I was after Katrina, I watched. I really paid attention and just tried to observe what was going on. There were a lot of people that came into New Orleans and told them what to do, and were very judgmental towards them. Oh, you should have done this. Why did you do that? And I learned the hard way that New Orleanians were going to be the incubators of their own innovation. And I think, Karen Gadbois, who is an artist and now a journalist there, she said to me, that they waited for months. They thought the cavalry was just coming across the hill. They were waiting for the cavalry. And then they realized the cavalry wasn't coming. And she said, and we realized we were the ones that we were waiting for. And I have that resonates with me. I have it actually here in a little poster behind me to remind me of it, that I think we have to really challenge ourselves to pay attention to what we see around us, try to learn like crazy what's going on in particular communities and in particular constituencies, and then start to navigate at a hyper-local level what we need our future to be. And then that then is going to percolate up to municipal policy, provincial policy, urban policy, and the resourcing requirements are going to come from that. But we need to start these things at the ground and just pay attention to how we are all responding to this, and how what kinds of structures we're going to need around us to enable us to be more resilient going forward.
Okay, great. Well, Mary, we are both very committed to facilitating learning between cities. So everybody, thank you for joining for a discussion that's part of that learning between cities. We are going to keep running the Committee for Sydney Live programming, and we'll hope to have most of you join future sessions. Mary, thank you very much, and we'll talk to you.
My pleasure. All the best to everybody there. Thanks, Gabe, for asking me.